Hello and welcome to Curzon Living Room, or I guess in this case, Curzon Dining Room Table. My name's Simran Hans and I'm a film critic for The Observer. And tonight I'll be in conversation about John Pilger's latest documentary, The Dirty War on the NHS, with Professor Allyson Pollock and Dr. John Lister. John Pilger's filmography spans 50 years and includes groundbreaking films from the front line in Vietnam and in Cambodia. And The Dirty War on the NHS was completed at the end of last year. Back then, little did any of us know exactly how frontline hospitals would be considered here in the UK, or would anybody have any idea that politicians would be invoking the language of war in the discussion of our health service and a national health emergency. Here to discuss the film with me, in light of the current situation, we've got Professor Allyson Pollock, Director of the Newcastle University Centre for Excellence in Regulatory Science, and Dr. John Lister, who's founder of Keep Our NHS Public and Senior Lecturer in Journalism and Health Journalism at Coventry University. You'll recognise both of their faces from the film, and we'd love to get you involved in the conversation. So if you're watching live on YouTube or Facebook, you can write your questions in the comments, or if you're watching on Twitter, you can tweet your questions using the hashtag Curzon Living Room. And we'll read out a selection as we kind of go along the evening. We're going to chat for about half an hour or so. So if this was in the room, this would be the point where I'd encourage you to give our guests a round of applause, but maybe you can do that at home. The film opens with a quote from our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, and the title card reads, "The NHS is safe in my hands." I wondered if you could both start by kind of reflecting on that moment and kind of thinking about how bitter that irony feels, several years down the line.
Who do you want to go first?
Whoever would like to go first.
John, do you want to go first, or will I?
Yeah, well,
okay.
Yes, go on, John, you start.
Okay. I think, that was 10 years ago, and we've had 10 years of the most brutal austerity imposed on the NHS. And on top of that, we had the legislation forced through with the Liberal Democrats votes in the House of Lords and in the Commons that basically aimed to dismantle the NHS the way it was and to move it towards a market-based system in which opening more and more opportunities for the private sector to take over profitable slices of the NHS and to maximise their degree of profiting from the NHS. Now, neither of those elements were in the manifesto that David Cameron put forward in 2010. And clearly, when we look at the ability of the NHS to respond to the current epidemic, when we look at the ability of the NHS to get through a normal winter, both of those have been massively impeded by the measures that were pushed through, and in particular the austerity that was driven through over the last 10 years. And we're still not out of that completely, because up until the point where all normal business was suspended by the epidemic, we still had the Johnson government promising less than required to even keep pace with costs of inflation and growing population over the next 4 to 5 years. And an amount quoted in cash terms rather than post-inflation, which meant that, in fact, the NHS was still facing 5 more years of austerity. And we have to see whether that remains the case as we come out the other side of a pandemic situation.
What about yourself, Allyson?
Well, I agree with everything John says. In many ways, the COVID epidemic, our response has been partly dictated and determined by the lack of both public health and NHS resources. So, first of all, we had an enormous delay. The government almost delayed 2 months when it let the virus rip throughout our whole community. And that was because it had actually carved out and decimated all the normal public health responses. So the normal public health response would have been to trace every single case and to look at track the contacts and to isolate and quarantine. And there just simply wasn't the resource to do that. And the government gave up very, very early instead of rebuilding the capacity that it needed. So that was the very first sign. which will be part of the big public inquiry, no doubt. But the second was the issue of the flattening of the epidemic curve. And what really became apparent was that the government panicked. It suddenly realized it didn't have enough hospital beds, it wasn't going to have enough ICU beds, and it wasn't going to have enough ventilators. It had known this already from modelling that had been done during previous epidemics, both the swine flu and subsequently in 2006 with the Cigna modelling. It knew that it didn't have enough capacity. But the whole response, the lockdown, was necessitated by A, the delay, enormous delay in not putting in place public health measures, and B, a response to the fact there was a lack of capacity in the acute health system. And that lack of capacity, of course, extends to the protective equipment, to the ventilators, to the acute hospital beds, to the shortages of nurses and shortages of doctors. So what this government has now done is created an emergency-only corona service. And so there's going to be enormous collateral damage, with tens of thousands of people dying and becoming ill who may not get the treatment that they actually need because they're in a corona epidemic. So we're already beginning to see the first signs of that with excess mortality. So when we come out of this epidemic, and there's likely to be a second and a third wave, the government really needs to be putting in place plans to rebuild and put back all the bits that it's lost, all the community hospitals that's closed, all the acute hospitals that's closed, and all the public health. And I want to say one other thing, because we're in the middle of this storm now, which is over social care and long-term care. This has been the most privatized of all the sectors. It's more privatized than even the US. We have nearly 450,000 people in largely for-profit independent sector nursing homes. It's a hugely fragmented sector with 11,000 different homes and 5,000 different providers. So very difficult to bring them together and marshal them together, let alone staff. There are 1.5 million care providers who've had no protection at all, mainly on low pay. A quarter of those are on 0 contract hours. So they're moving from home to home. They're carrying the virus with them because they have no choice. They're not paid if they're sick. And the government has not put in the protection around those staff and around the most vulnerable. So we are failing at the moment the most vulnerable in our society. And that is going to go on longer term after this epidemic, because there's going to be an enormous backlog of work, enormous backlog of need, and the government needs to rebuild and put back the capacity that John has described that was taken out, not just over 10 years, but 20 years and 30 years. And it needs to rebuild and bring back a new Act of Parliament that gives us back our NHS in England.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I want to talk about some of John's strategies for kind of communicating the urgency of this message as a filmmaker. In the film, he goes to the States. He looks at sort of pop-up emergency healthcare they have there, because obviously they don't have an NHS. I wonder sort of what you both feel as activists in your own right it will take for people to take this seriously and kind of realize how quickly things are escalating and how much damage could be accrued at this speed.
John.
Well, I think one of the striking things about what has been done since the pandemic has really hit is that virtually all of the legislation of 2012 has actually been suspended one way or the other. They've either been ignoring it or actually suspended it. So we've got a complete pause on the contracting arrangements. They're actually now their block contracts are arranged for the work. NHS England has overruled all of the local clinical commissioning groups, which is the ones who actually been required by the 2012 Act to contract stuff out to the private sector. I mean, partly so that NHS England can do a deal with private hospitals, but I mean, it's still a very significant overruling of the existing legislation, and the trusts have been not only told that big deficits they built up in terms of loans to try to get through the financial squeeze, those loans are now being cancelled and they won't have to pay them back. But they're also now told they don't have to implement those cost-saving proposals that are being driven towards this year. So virtually all normal business under the so-called reformed NHS have actually come to a halt. Nobody misses them. They didn't contribute anything positive at all. And the question is, can we create enough pressure to ensure they're not put back in place when we come out of this? And we have an investment program along the lines that Allyson is talking about to reinstate capacity. But we also talk about a structure that actually reintegrates the NHS as a public service. And actually, you know, if we look at the way in which the private contractors, for example, the fact that they don't pay proper sick pay in cleaning and catering services in hospitals, they don't pay proper sick pay to their staff. Staff are coming in sick and potentially catching and spreading disease across during the pandemic. If you look at the 111 service, which is massively privatized, we're looking at staff there who are not given sick pay. They're coming in and infecting their colleagues in the call centres that run the 111 service. We're looking at NHS supplies, which was supposed to be delivering the PPE around the NHS, was again reprivatized last year and with a whole new network of private contracts, which has lamentably failed. And even to the point that even the military being brought in can't get the PPE supplies delivered as they should be. And all of the statements made by ministers in this have been proved completely false. So I think, do we want to go back to where we were before when the pandemic ends? You'd have to make an argument for any of the things that have been stripped away now actually being put back. So I think potentially we've got the basis for rethink on a whole series of different questions. And I'll just add the other interesting thing on an economic front. The Financial Times at the beginning of April came out with a really interesting editorial in which they effectively abandoned all the push for neoliberal reforms and are saying we've got to now have government spending at the centre of public services, we've got to have investment in public services, and we've got to have radical reform to actually put services back together again. Now, if that's the Financial Times, I think we should be, we've got some strange allies, but I think, you know, we need to look at ways in which we can make sure that this is not put back the way it was at the beginning of this year, and it's put back more along the lines of the old NHS that we had before, and that we actually get back to those traditional values again.
Yep, I agree with John. I think one of the worrying things now, though, about this government is the NHS directions that it brought out on the 23rd of March really gives NHS England unlimited powers to make lots of private contracts. And it's actually currently throwing hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds at private contractors. We've yet to see these contracts. And we don't know whether how accountable they are, because the government's just simply throwing a lot of money at the problem, when it could actually be beginning to start to think, let's plan to reintegrate this service, as John says, let's get rid of all the market mechanisms, they don't work, and let's rebuild capacity. But in the meanwhile, the government is throwing billions of pounds at Nightingale hospitals, et cetera, expanding capacity. But at the same time, hospitals that are threatened with closure still are under threat of closure, and so are all the beds. So we have the final irony of a lot of NHS trusts and which have got beds, which have got capacity, which are still being threatened with closure. And this is no way to deliver a healthcare system through a fragmented, privatised system. But I think the real worry is that Simon Stevens is going to carry on full steam ahead. And if anything, these directions and this legislation gives them extraordinary powers to continue to carve up the NHS and to privatise it and to downsize it and to give more and more money to the private sector, including the nursing homes, which are, remember, more than 80% are for-profit owned with big equity investors. They're big multinational chains, 450,000 beds. And yet the government is still continuing to throw money at these homes without thinking we need, our social care is a shame, it's a disgrace, and we need to think through a proper plan and a proper strategy. Now we could do this if we wanted to do it, but it's not very clear that this government wants to do it. And I'll just say one other thing, that many of the logistics and supply problems that John has talked about are a direct result, not just of government incompetence, but of the whole privatization, the consolidation, the centralization of pathology labs, of testing, and the outsourcing of all these facilities, and the downgrading of facilities and staff. And we have lost a huge amount of capacity. And this is one of the major causes of the huge death rates that we are now experiencing and the crisis that we're in.
I'm kind of interested to talk a little bit about the issue of debt and how that's kind of handled in the film, and I guess think about it in light of Matt Hancock's comments about wiping 13 billion pounds worth of debt from that the NHS owe. And I guess I'm interested in this idea of that debt being an external debt, but in the film, the 80 million pounds worth of debt is internal, right? It's the debt from Tony Blair's private finance initiatives. I'm interested to kind of hear your thoughts on what the logistics of that will look like, and how best the government kind of deal with that problem.
Shall I go first again?
Yeah, sure, John. Yeah.
I mean, the trust deficits that have been written off, the 13.4 billion of trust deficits, these are loans that were taken out by trusts over the last 5 or 6 years to actually compensate for the fact they were not properly funded. So they've been borrowing money to prop up budgets, quite often still missing the targets they were supposed to set for actually financial discipline, but they're still, but they've basically run up debt, some of them in the hundreds of several of them, hundreds of millions of pounds of deficits. Now, these were never actually going to be repaid anyway. The trust cannot possibly repay them without cuts beyond the scale that anybody could possibly imagine. So they were never going to be repaid. And the fact that they've been written off, the statement that said they were writing them off from the Department of Health also said it wasn't going to cost the Exchequer any extra money. It's basically a bookkeeping exercise. They've switched them from one column to another. And the whole idea of this deficit was a fiction in the first place, and to much extent, because how can trusts owe the government money? You know, this is just ridiculous. So so in other words, while appearing very generous, they've not actually given the trust any extra money to work with that they didn't have before. And so the big question remains how we actually get those resources in to actually, for example, we've still got £6.5 billion worth of backlog maintenance to be done in the trust. We've got hospitals actually falling down, including in Boris Johnson's constituency, falling down and condemned in terms of delivering modern treatment. So we need that, but that's not part of the proposals that have been made so far. We need the PFI deficits, which are still 51 billion to be paid off by 2048, according to the Treasury's most recent statements. 51 billion still needs to be addressed there. Well, these are deficits are hanging like a millstone around the necks of trusts that are trying to actually deliver services. They need to be written off as well. And at the end of the day, we also need revenue income to the trust to enable them to deliver the services. And where necessary, to invest additional money in bringing staff in-house to ensure that they can be delivered as part of the NHS. And that's not going to be necessarily any cheaper, but it will be much better in terms of the delivery of services and the quality of services that can be provided.
Well, I agree with John, and one of the issues is these so-called PFI debts. So a lot of the deficit was due to the fact that not only trusts were underfunded, but they weren't being compensated for the enormous unitary charge they're paying every year on the private finance initiative. Now, ironically, the government, instead of taking back all these contracts and reopening them and renegotiating them, after all, interest rates are 0.11%. And yet, in many of these contracts, the interest rates are anything from 5 to 15%. And on the subordinated debt, there will be around 15% interest. So this is exorbitant, and this is what's actually draining resources out of hospitals. And those debts are still being paid. The hospitals will still be paying these unitary charges. So these debts will still be accumulating. So all the government has done is wipe the debts of the foundation trusts, which ironically it landed them with because it wanted to have greater control over foundation trusts because they had so much autonomy. And that was one way of getting around it. But actually, what the government hasn't done is gone to a root cause analysis and looked at the whole PFI problem more than ever. Just as the big high street stores are renegotiating their rental payments with their owners, the government should be reopening these PFI deals and saying, right, take your interest rates right down to 1% or 2%. We're not prepared to pay any more than that. And so the public has been fleeced so many times over. And my real worry is that the government will continue with its privatization program. It's already got Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers running the show for the Department of Health. Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers and the management consultants are absolutely, and McKinsey's are everywhere at the moment during this COVID epidemic, including with the informing the science and the expertise and gathering the data. So what we have to do is have a major public inquiry into all the issues that are going on. And actually that gives us the opportunity to rebuild a new Act of Parliament, which will reinstate our NHS, its founding principles, reintegrate it, and also take social care on board as well. I feel very, very strongly that the fragmentation and privatization of social care has left the most vulnerable staff and the most vulnerable of people out in the cold, and they're the ones that have been really, really let down shamefully during this whole epidemic.
I mean, we're in an interesting moment in terms of sort of collective mobilization and sort of public awareness about the NHS. It's in the news constantly. Even people like Piers Morgan, who aren't particularly known for having sort of lefty political views, are saying that they're, you know, he's saying that he's going to pay for all the parking tickets of, you know, NHS staff members because even the parking is privatized. You know, we're encouraged to do our kind of weekly clap for NHS workers. And yet there still seems to be a lack of clarity coming from the government about what really needs to be done, what the positive changes need to be. There's a question from Anne C, who asked this in a more direct way. She says, how can we put the government under pressure to make these positive changes for the NHS? You know, my further question to that is, how do we kind of collectively lobby for a public inquiry? And what's the timeline for that going to look like when we're kind of in the midst of this crisis that we're dealing with and things are becoming more urgent?
John, do you want to go? Or,
yeah,
take that one, Alison, first.
Okay. Well, people are very, very engaged with the NHS because people are very frightened and with social care because they're experiencing it firsthand and seeing firsthand relatives, friends, people dying and staff. But actually that doesn't give them an analysis. And this is why it's so important, the film that John's made, but also the work that John Lister does, Keep Our NHS Public. This is really vital work that all these groups are doing on the ground to allow people to understand what is happening to the NHS, because people don't really understand the extent to which the privatization and fragmentation has been, and the decimation of services has been the major cause of the problem in this country. So people still don't understand or know the extent to which that is what has driven our response to the epidemic curve. And this is where we're at. So this is why it's very important to have films like John and all John Lister's work and campaigning, which he's been doing for 30 or 40 years. And more people need to be engaged. And a public inquiry, it's never too early to start thinking about the terms of reference for this public inquiry. And I think we should be starting now, which begins with what happened on the 31st of January when the first 2 cases happened. Why was there a delay? Why did we not make it a notifiable disease till the 5th of March in England? And why did we not do anything until the 23rd of March? Why did we let the virus let rip? And why were we not better prepared in every single area of the NHS and social care for this? So it's not too, we must start to ask the questions, and we must start to ask the scientific advisory groups and the CSO and the CMO. Everybody has to be brought to account in this.
Part of the Mutual Admiration Society, obviously I endorse what Alison's been saying and welcome the big fight that's been going on, Alison's been waging and others on the public health agenda, which is absolutely vital as well. And the whole question about testing and so on, which is essential. I think we have to bite the bullet here, because we've got a completely ineffective opposition at the present time. We've got people who are not raising any kind of sharp questions. Keir Starmer seems more keen to agree with the government than actually challenge them on anything at all. So I think we have to bite the bullet, and we have to say, look, if we want to influence this government, which has got an 80 majority, we actually have to reach out and try to convince some Tories to come with us and actually recognise that actually there's political benefits for them in actually not putting it back the way it was. They gain credibility if they were able to learn the lessons of what's been done better as a result of the legislation being suspended, the changes that have been made, and make sure that it isn't put back the way it was. And I think we have to do that. It's not particularly tasteful to me from my political standpoint, but I think we have to find ways in which we can actually talk to some of those MPs, get a body of people, a cross-party body that's prepared to stand up for putting the NHS back as it ought to be, back as a public service, reinstating it, reclaiming it as a public service, and building on the fact that the public affection for it exactly as that, is absolutely clear and demonstrated every Thursday night, and demonstrated in so many different ways. 750,000 volunteers, all of the various ways in which people show they want the NHS put back together again. Now, I don't think actually the Johnson government will be feeling all that strong in trying to actually go against that mood and try to proceed with a privatisation agenda. And I think we have to seize that moment. It's not a very big moment, it's an opportunity that will be opening up between the high point of this crisis and the point where things start to unwind again. And we just need to put the pressure on, say, don't go back to where we were. Let's learn the lessons. Let's strip away this legislation that does nothing but impede and break up and fragment and divide the NHS. And let's get it back to working efficiently as a public service. And nobody will want to oppose you in doing that. And everybody will thank you for having done it. And, if anybody can see the sense in that, then we can maybe make some gains even with a Tory majority of 80. Who knows?
We're kind of coming to the end of the Q&A now. But, as my kind of last question, I really am curious to hear both of you talk a little bit about John Pilger and what it was like to be part of his film, and to kind of sort of be interviewed by him in that very dynamic way. I think a lot of documentary filmmakers take themselves outside of the film, but he's very much part of it, and his journalism is the force that fuels the film as well. So I wonder if you both could just say a few words about John, because he can't be here to join us.
Alison, do you want to go first?
Well, I think I'm not alone in having great admiration and respect for the work that John has done. And so it was an extraordinary moment when John decided to make a film about the NHS. And I think also the comparison with the US was really, really important, because I think so many people hear about the stories from the US, but he brought those two into amazing juxtaposition. Of course, I was only interviewed briefly by John, and that was a very pleasurable experience, of course, but seeing that film unfold the way it did was very moving. And we just all have a deep debt of gratitude to John for making this film, along with all the other filmmakers who he's also acknowledged. But it was great that John, who's done so much in other spheres, especially in war-torn countries, was able to take the lens and really look at our NHS, because he obviously feels as passionately about it as we all do. It's something that's very, very sacred to everybody. And that's why we're all fighting so hard to have our NHS. And we will all continue to fight to have our NHS.
Yes, I think from a campaigner's point of view, meeting a campaigning journalist with such a track record was great, and fantastic to get the invitation and so forth. And I think it's clearly an asset for campaigners to actually be able to refer to this film and to the work behind it, and as a kind of a landmark on the way to building bigger and better campaigns. And I think the most important thing is that it doesn't just wind up with people angry, but convinced that it's necessary, but it's also possible to push things back. And if there's one criticism I make of the film, it's the phrase selling off, right? Selling off the NHS. Actually, it's not being sold off, it's contracted out, and actually it can be put back. And I think that's really quite an important point. And I know it makes an easier phrase to talk about selling off, and it's much more complicated. But I do think that if I was going to make a criticism, it would be that one. But it was good fun, and I think the film plays a very useful role. And if we can build around it and take forward into this new situation, a fight, re-energized by that film, that would be great for all of us.
Yeah, and it's a film for our time and of our time at the moment. So thank you, John.
Brilliant. I'd like to thank Dartmouth Films for making this event possible, and for everybody who watched along. If you only caught the Q&A, the film is still available to rent on Curzon Home Cinema. So if you haven't watched it, go and watch it. If you have watched it, go tell your friends about it. And most of all, I'd like to thank our guests, Professor Allyson Pollock and Dr. John Lister. You can find out more about John Pilger and watch his films on his website, johnpilger.com. It's a really rich and wide-ranging resource of documentary filmmaking, so I would recommend checking that out. And if you are having fun with this Curzon Living Room Q&A format, Joanna Hogg will be discussing her film The Souvenir on Friday the 17th of April at 8:30. And joining her will be the film stars Honor Swinton-Byrne and Tom Burke. That Q&A will be hosted by journalist Ian Hayden-Smith. And what a brilliant opportunity to be able to hear from Joanna and Honor and Tom. So do join then. And until then, good night. Thank you.